Hello, friends. Happy New Year 2026. The Our Weekly Highlights podcast is back for the new year. We definitely had a little bit of a break to recharge our respective data science batteries, however you want to call it, time with family. But I hope you all are having a great start to 2026. But yeah, it feels great to finally be back behind the microphone and talking to you all about the latest highlights that have been shared in this week's Our Weekly issue. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted you join us from wherever you are around the world. And yes, thankfully, I'm not alone in 2026, as my awesome co-host Mike Thomas is here, virtually joining me as always. Mike, yeah, hard to believe, 2026 already. It's amazing how time flies. Yep.
Another year, more Mike and Eric, Our Weekly Highlights. Let's keep going strong.
We'll keep going as long as this train doesn't stop moving. So we'll see how far we get. But speaking of how far we get, there's a little inside baseball here. Around the end of the year, usually there's a certain person on the Our Weekly team that's in charge of making the schedules for the curation. Guess who forgot to do that until last weekend? Yes, that was me. So that meant that with a short notice of notifying everyone else about the schedule, I guess I better do the issue. So it was me curating this week, but we'll have the full rotation already programmed up, ready to go for the rest of our team. But yeah, I had to dust off the holiday cobwebs a little bit. But as always, we had some terrific pull requests to our GitHub repository for Our Weekly, which was a massive help. So thanks to all of you around the world and my fellow curators for helping with this week's issue. And we're going to lead off with kind of a recap of a very important and very highly talked about theme stemming from the recent POSIT conference in 2025, and that is seeing the influence that goes kind of bi-directional, but definitely in ways that us as our users can appreciate in the world of not just the verses, so to speak, of R and Python, but really working together and benefiting from each other in terms of dev practices and community practices. And that is very succinctly talked about in our first highlight here, coming to us from Emily Riederer, who is a senior manager of data science at Capital One. And she has been one of the top thought leaders in this space of going across different data science languages and using them to your best advantage across both ways. And her post here is entitled R and Python, From Polygot to Pluralism. And her main thesis here of the post is about, you know what? The days of the verses of the language wars, yeah, they're kind of done. This is now more about how can we get better data science accomplished, leveraging the best of each of these ecosystems, and how can they learn from each other. So in her mind, you know, having the diversity from the intellectual dev standpoint and the community standpoint, it just literally helps make the tooling better. And this was highlighted quite a lot in many of the POSIT conference talks, and she talks about a few of them here. And of course, my co-host looking at me is no stranger to this topic. He'll touch on that in a little bit here. But she shouts out two of the talks that leads off this post here regarding how best practices with R package development in recent years have really begun to influence Python development. And these talks were given by Richie Owen and Michael Chow over at POSIT, talking about their various Python packages and what they have learned from their days of building the R package equivalents. So on Rich's viewpoint, he has made the Great Tables package in Python, which is the analog to GT from the R side of things. So he has some really nice points in the post here that Emily highlights in this, in that it's about not just the code itself, but really understanding that different users are going to have different needs for their package, and having that user experience, that onboarding about how to use the package being heavily featured and addressed in the package documentation, as well as built-in data sets to help try these things out. So Rich's talk was excellent. I didn't see it live, but I've seen the recording of it, talking about these attributes and how they've informed a great tables development. And I've been on record many times on this very podcast saying Rich authors some of the best documentation I've ever seen for packages, and he's carrying that same mindset to the Python side as well with great tables. And then Michael Chow's talk called the curse of documentation. This was an interesting take on this as well, but it's also his experience with making sure that there isn't just all terse documentation from a quote-unquote API-like standpoint, which a lot of Python modules and packages do get very terse with their documentation, but having more of the long-form vignette-style documentation is very helpful for those that are getting to know the package for the first time. And that is something that the Python community, I think, is slowly adopting. But R had it here first, as I say, thinking all the way back to Fritz Leisch building what became SWeave that was built into R since the very beginning. Of course, we've had R Markdown since then, but being able to build literate programming literally in the language itself, and we're seeing a lot of tooling in Python and elsewhere adopt those kind of mindsets. And then she also mentions that it kind of goes both ways as well, so to speak, from the engineering side of it. We're seeing some advancements in the R ecosystem to take advantage of newer libraries to help with code development, such as the highly regarded Air utility based in Rust to help lint R code. And it is blazing fast. I love using it. I use it every day in my positron editor. It just cleans up so much for me on that little Control-S keyboard shortcut. And then also a shout out to the rig utility built by Posit as well, as a way to manage multiple R installations on a host system, no matter Windows, Mac, or Linux. That is something that Python has been trying to address, sometimes with mixed success, depending on the framework you use for managing Python libraries and installations. And we're seeing also how, say, the Tidy Models team was heavily informed by what scikit-learn has done in their machine learning exploits on the Python side. So there's a lot of interesting ways that both language communities are benefiting from each other in these practices. And it's really, really interesting to see how far this takes. And Mike, you're no stranger to this. You deal with both languages, and you've been a highly regarded voice in this matter too. What did you think of Emily's post here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been very inspired by Emily in the past, really, on this topic. I know she gave a talk at PositConf, I think it was 2 years ago. It was called, cleverly titled, Python Ergonomics. And I took a lot of inspiration from that in developing the talk that I gave at this past year's PositConf on building multilingual data science teams, which I believe was in the sort of the same session as Rich and Michael's talk, which was fantastic. And obviously developers like Rich and Michael are really doing a great job of bringing R's great focus on user experience to Python through their table packages like Great Tables and Point Blank. And we also have other packages like Plot9 in Python that mirrors ggplot2 in R. It's more great work from Posit to essentially make these capabilities language agnostic. It's just pick whichever language you want, and the same tooling essentially will be there for you. Some of the key traits that I think are being adopted by Python, as Emily mentions, is making packages nicer by including sample data sets. We take for granted that forever, if you install a package, there is almost always a package data set that enables you to get up to speed quicker and run examples that you see. I think of dplyr, we always have the Star Wars data set, right? It's just built in for us to test out all of the different crazy things that dplyr can do for us without needing to load some CSV that we need to have on our laptop first. So it allows users to get up and running a lot quicker. And I think that really bleeds into documentation in terms of vignettes for Python and them trying to move beyond what they may have had in the past around package documentation. My guess is that package down, the R package that allows us to build these HTML websites that we can host with GitHub pages and things like that, probably really distance R from Python in terms of robustness of the documentation in the last few years. I'm assuming the Python community caught wind of what package down could do, and I think created a fairly obvious gap. And obviously, I think Quarto has also been a game changer here. And the more that we can enable developers to leverage Quarto in package documentation and wire those two things together, I think the more that we can provide clarity to end users and LLMs, unfortunately, nowadays, on how to best use our R and Python packages. And as you mentioned, Python, like robustness in R, R is gaining high performance developer tooling that's very much inspired by Python. We think of Air, the code formatter you mentioned. Rig is another one that Emily mentions that helps to mirror the functionality and feel of PyEnv for helping users manage multiple R versions. If you are a Docker user, there is a dev container feature in the Rocker project that allows you to essentially leverage Rig to install the exact version of R that you want to install in that container. So if you were trying to do reproducible data science, as we really have a focus on our team, that may be helpful for you. It's something that we use in just about every project that we hand off to clients in particular, because we know that it will work on their machine exactly as intended. So I really think that this blog post is another fantastic one from Emily on this particular topic. Anything that she puts out is essentially required reading, in my view. I think sort of this concept of intellectual diversity, makes tools better across both R and Python. And when developers from these different backgrounds collide and come together, we get better engineering in R and we get better design in Python.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with a lot of those points. Another utility that we've been seeing slowly get some attention on the Python side, active package management side of it, UV has been highly regarded as another way to manage your project-specific dependencies. And we're now seeing an R sort of equivalent called RV that we talked about, I think, late last year. So, yeah, reproducible data science on the tooling side, as well as being able to leverage a package effectively. We're in a good time here. And with the advent of having to, use the best tool for the job, the gaps have definitely tightened a bit, but there will be cases where you need to hop back and forth, and that's where having the choices, but also what to look for, is highly important. So I dare say this is a great start for stuffing my data science Polygot wallet, if you will, with some great content. Yes, I've been watching too much ESPN lately. You're welcome.
I will second the UV comment. If you are starting a new Python project or just getting into Python, start with UV instead of any of those other Python environment managers. It is so easy to use and it just works fast. And I did just see RV come across my desk, as you mentioned, Eric. I have not tried it yet. I don't know if you have, but I'm excited to take a look.
It is really promising. So I look forward to playing with this even more, even as the veteran of PackRat and RM, which we have a mostly beneficial relationship. Sometimes things go haywire, though. So I'm always looking to see what else is out there. So, yeah, there's a couple mic drop moments right away in this podcast.
Choices are good.
And yes, 2026, you can't escape the use of LLMs across much of our dev workflow. And boy, when they work well, they really work well. But there's always that age-old trade-off, right? Of if what I'm building now requires something that has some knowledge, so to speak, or resource that wasn't necessarily used to train these models, just what do you do? What if you have this very intricate source of information, domain-specific wise, that you want to have available to you, but you know that off-the-shelf Gemini or Claude model just doesn't have any exposure to it? That's where a really important technique that I've heard about for a long time, admittedly was kind of intimidated by until recently, called Retrieval Augmented Generation, RAG for short, is a very important set of tooling, so to speak, that you can have in your next project that has a leverage the use of AI. And how the heck do you get started from this as an R user? Well, guess what? The tooling has definitely caught up. Speaking of, tooling and our ecosystem getting up to speed much quicker these days, there is some great packages out there that you can use to build your own knowledge storage in R to be tapped into by various LLMs. And this tutorial blog post comes to us from Miles Mitchell over at Jumping Rivers. And this is a great practical post on how you can build a RAG knowledge store using just off-the-shelf packages in the R ecosystem. So as we talked about, this is where RAG is important for a lot of reasons here. One of which, like I said, is if you have another additional context source, if you will, typically documentation, maybe reports or whatnot, and you want to make that available to your LLM session or model provider to be able to tap into as needed. So there are lots of different phases of this, but luckily in R, there is a particular package that can help you get started really quickly. And that comes to us from the Posit team called Ragnar. And this is a very important package in this space. We'll link to it in the show notes as always. But this is helping you implement RAG all in the confines of R itself. And it's got a few different steps in this process, but we'll walk through a little bit here verbally what that entails. First of which, you got to have that knowledge source available, hopefully in a web kind of friendly text format. A lot of times, say, Markdown documentation sites are a great source of this. So in this example, they're actually looking at the web version of a textbook called Efficient R Programming, co-authored by one of the founders of Jumping Rivers, Colin Gillespie. And that URL is available. You can find that in the show notes as well. So what Ragnar lets you do is read the contents of that website as Markdown with the appropriate name, read as Markdown function. Once you have that, this is now split up into what are called kind of chunks in a nice tidy tibble, with each chunk being a different row, and then the text actually containing the actual like verbatim text in that particular chunk as defined by the starting and ending index of characters. Now that's just step one. You can actually visualize this in your R session with a Ragnar chunks view function, which is neat to kind of see what's behind the scenes there. But this is not ready for the models yet. There is something you need to do to create under the hood what's been known as like a vector database, a way to translate this text into tokens that then the LLMs can use. And that's where there is a Ragnar store create function that will help you take into this, or define, I should say, what this kind of internal vector database will look like. But the embeddings are model specific. So depending on which model you're using, you might have to use a different embed function that comes from the package, such as one for Gemini, maybe one for OpenAI, whatever else. They have separate functions for each of these. Once you have that kind of store set up, then you feed in those chunks that you got from the website into that store. And then from there, you got it in the store, but imagine like a grocery store where all the products are not organized yet. You got to actually start organizing this and create an index. And that's where the Ragnar store build index function comes in to get it actually ready for the LLM usage. So all this is stepped through in the blog post. But once you have that, then you can actually start to use this using the Ragnar retrieve function, such as in the example here. They take that store as the first input and then ask a question, who are the authors of efficient R programming. And sure enough, you get a tibble back, and it will give you text that actually tell you in the, well, actually not so much text yet, but the actual, well, not just the text, it's a context, it's a distance calculations, all in the confines of this vector database investigation. And you will actually see then the text showing the authors there. So there is a lot of interesting things you can do with this, because if you want to feed in more than one source, you can feed multiple, sets of knowledge chunks into these stores and just kind of rinse and repeat along the way. And then lo and behold, you can set up via the Elmer package, a chat function or chat object, I should say, and then register this store as another means for that particular model in Elmer to get this knowledge. And sure enough, they do just that with asking it some questions about, say, good practices for parallel computing in R, and then it can even tell you where it got the answer from. So some things to watch out for is as you're building these stores, these different chunks into these stores, this is going to add to your token count when you go back and forth between these model providers. So cost may or may not be an issue, depends on your organization. But this is a great way to get started with getting that internal resource ready for your models to run. And I think this is a great way to jumpstart your RAG journey into using packages like Elmer and the like to supercharge your next chat sessions. So, Mike, have you done much of RAGs lately? This sounds like a pretty interesting technique here.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit with RAG, and I think there's always been a trade-off for AI engineers. I don't know if it's starting to change or if it has changed, but the concept of leveraging RAG versus actually trying to fine-tune your own model, which I believe would be actually potentially training an LM or doing some form of that would be the fine-tuning, which is, I think, much more difficult than leveraging RAG. And if you can get good results out of your RAG setup, it's probably a lot easier to sort of stand that solution up. And right, the real problem that everybody's dealing with is that LLMs, tend to hallucinate a lot because they lack, real-time information, or they will hallucinate because they don't have access to the data that you are asking it about because it wasn't trained on that. And they have gotten better at this, I think, in more recent times, where maybe they'll actually admit that they don't know the answer to your question. But I remember when LLMs were first coming out, if you asked them, a question, like I had asked them who Catchbrook Analytics was, I think at one point in time, and it just made up a completely fake company that said they were in pharmaceutical sales or something like that. You couldn't find it on the internet. I don't know. Maybe there is another Catchbrook Analytics, but it was interesting. They hallucinated, all the time. Unless you had that RAG set up and you gave them specific information about the question that you were asking, and that RAG workflow, really helps to provide that model with sort of this external knowledge store, as we call it, which are often our documentation to look up the information before answering. And the first step of that process is parsing that documentation into something that the LLM can read. And as you mentioned, that's where the Ragnar package comes in to build that knowledge store and extract text from these PDF documents or other sources, chunking it into contextual pieces and storing that in a vector database so that the model can search on it efficiently. And then Elmer is sort of the second piece to that equation that allows our users to interact with various LLM APIs, such as OpenAI, Google Gemini, Claude, and leverage that connection to the RAG store that they were able to create. And Miles does a great job providing us with an example, building that knowledge store using the efficient R programming textbook, registering it with Elmer, and then the LLM, clearly, accurately answers some of those technical questions. I think about parallel computing, and even cites exactly where it found the information, which I know is an important sort of development and very important for production level workflows as well, and auditability and traceability in a lot of domain settings. I think sort of at a higher level, RAG sort of makes LLMs production ready. for a lot of organizational use cases where they need specialized access to knowledge that's really specific to your organization and might be outside of the corpus of data that the LLM was trained on, and or you may potentially just want to have the LLM focused on the information that you want it to know about, and really not care about all of the other potential information that it was trained on. Last year, we had built out a simple Gradio app to demonstrate RAG and gave it a single PDF. This wasn't publicly available information in the PDF for its knowledge store. And we had a really cool component to that app that was a button that could toggle RAG on or off. And if RAG was on, I would ask it some random question like, give me a recipe for banana bread, which was totally different, than the PDF context we were giving. And it would actually come back to me and say, hey, I don't think that's appropriate right now because I'm sort of set up to answer questions about this particular domain. And I thought that was awesome.
Oh.
So that might be an interesting thing if you need to sort of demonstrate the capabilities of RAG in your Shiny app or some sort of a web interface like Gradio, to consider doing something like that, because it was really eye-opening for a lot of our audience.
Yeah, I'm jotting that down as I start to build more interfaces on top of these. But yeah, it's a very interesting technique, and it does make it makes it important. Another thing to underscore is if you want to use this, having that knowledge store or that source of that knowledge store, hopefully easy to digest via these mechanisms. I know in a lot of organizations, a lot of knowledge is locked in proprietary files and whatnot. So it can be a Herculean effort to get that ready for consumption into RAG. But boy, I think the benefits will definitely pay off if you can get support to translate some of this internal domain knowledge into ways that we can leverage more effectively. I mean, even basics like PDFs of these certain, in the pharma side of things, something called the schedule of events that determine when patients get certain, treatment drug versus like lab assessments versus other assessments. A lot of that's locked away in some very bad formats, and we're trying to make more machine readable formats of all of this so that in the future, things like RAG could be built to help interrogate some past, study information or whatnot. Still a very long ways to go in this space, but I'm excited to see just where you can take these techniques and building interfaces on top of it, because these models can't do everything, folks. You got to help it out along the way. And rounding out our highlights today, Mike and I are always fans of Shiny. So as I'm curating this issue and I get this list of the new packages that have come since our last issue, as well as the updated packages, and there was one that particularly caught my eye as far as like, what we might talk about, or at least might be featured in the highlights section. And I saw this package called tinyshinyserver. And I thought, that's interesting. What is this all about? So I started reading up it has just landed on Grand recently. So I started looking up the GitHub repo, and I saw things, Mike, that boy sure sounded kind of familiar, but this is all done in R itself. So let's talk about what this has been built for, at least according to the README. This is appropriate for hosting multiple Shiny apps behind a single server. Sounds familiar. Development environments of multiple projects. Yeah, maybe. Small-scale production deployments. Ooh, you and I deal with production all the time. And hosting R Markdown and Quartal dashboards with the Shiny runtime. Okay. This is intriguing. So I actually gave it a spin on my Nixify dev environment set up at my other computer. And for the most part, it did basically what was advertised. And what's interesting is once you define a directory of your app / dashboard, if you're doing like Quartal dashboard or Flex dashboard on the R Markdown side, you basically make a subdirectory, and they have an example directory you can copy straight from the package itself. And within that, you could have any number of Shiny apps as subdirectories. So they have simple inventory one, simple reporting one, a sales one, and whatnot. And then there is a configuration file in JSON called config.json, where you spell out all these different apps, each get their own, sub-entry, the name of it, where it's located on the file system, and then another interesting flag called resident. If resident is set to true, that means that the app is quote unquote always running. This would be very similar to in the classic, Shiny server days. The app is just running no matter what, or like Posit Connect internally. Whereas if it's set to false, it'll only spin up when it's accessed. That part sounds really familiar to me. You probably will comment on that in a little bit. But I'm wondering, just how does that work just from the R side of things? That usually is kind of like a container kind of thing to make sure that is only spun up on demand, much like services like Shiny Apps IO would do, or you'll probably mention another one in a little bit. I won't steal your thunder there. Now, I will say I tried that feature. It did not work on my system. So there may be a little bit of gotchas in how that was all implemented, but it was intriguing nonetheless to see them trying to pull it off. So this README is quite comprehensive. I kept looking. It's like there's a lot of options here, a lot of configuration, even about if you're going to host this behind a proxy or SSL, some instructions for that if you want to do like an Nginx kind of reverse proxy or a caddy file. So all this is very DevOps-y kind of features here too, with a management interface as well if you want to look at a high level of all these apps. So I was, admittedly very blown away just how much could be accomplished literally with just an R package to do all this. And then I did a little, I like to, shout out whoever authors these utilities on R Weekly. So I took a look at the root of the repository. Lab 1702, I believe, is the alias. And then I read the description. Just some random hobby projects I made throughout the years. The more recent stuff is mostly AI created as a way to learn how to work with AI. And sure enough, if you go to the tinyshinyserver GitHub repo, on GitHub, you always see like a contributors link or set of contributors on the right side. Sure enough, right under Lab 1702 is Claude. So I'm guessing this was a mostly AI generated package. I will say though, how it got there, I have no idea. I mean, it sounds like Claude somehow, but I must say pretty impressive how far it went. I'm not going to pretend to say I'm going to use this in production anytime soon, but it's a great way to see just using some of the dependency packages that they reference here in the description file, such as like the WebSockets kind of packages. But really, it's HTTP UV. It's not a huge dependency footprint. Might be an interesting learning opportunity nonetheless. So yeah, impressed in a few different ways. But definitely caught my eye, and it just shows you if I hadn't started looking around that GitHub repo, I was almost completely fooled. Maybe it was because of lack of sleep too. I don't know. But this is probably going to be more common than we realize, Mike. So very interested in your takes on what tinyshinyserver is trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make any assumptions on how much of it was AI generated versus how much of it was sort of human reviewed. I assume all of us, are doing that to some extent these days. But I think, as you mentioned, Eric, probably there is a real thing going on in the ecosystem in data science in general where fully AI generated stuff is getting out there for better or for worse. This concept is, I think, excellent. Having a sort of more lightweight, WebSocket enabled proxy server designed to host maybe a couple Shiny apps and our Markdown documents and Quarto dashboards behind a single server. I think, obviously there's great need for making productionizing of your data science content easier, right? If possible, especially in smaller settings. I think WebR has done some of that for us, but I think for a lot of folks, it's probably still a little scary territory because there are some gotchas. From my experience on hosting, Shiny apps, for example, with WebR that are very, very niche to that WebR framework, as opposed to if you were just running it obviously on your own laptop. But I think this is really, really interesting. As you mentioned, one of that standout features that they market in the repository's README is the resident versus on-demand apps, where resident apps are always running. I think this gets into R sessions, right? You would have to have different apps run on different ports from the same R session. I imagine that we're only spawning a single R session in this process, or maybe not.
It seemed like one to me when I ran it last night. It was pretty bizarre.
Obviously, you couldn't get that on-demand apps, the other side of it, up and running. And I would imagine that would have to mean that you would have multiple R sessions running in order to have one spin down. But obviously, if I had two apps, one was a resident and one was on demand, I would assume that I would need two R sessions. I'm not sure. And then sort of the questions then become, what's the separation between users? Are they sharing sessions, not sharing sessions? A project that we talk a lot about and implement quite a bit for a lot of our clients and even ourselves is the Shiny Proxy project, which this feels kind of like a lightweight Shiny Proxy environment. And that is very much Docker based, such that every app that gets spun up for a particular user is in a separate container, sort of by default. You can do some things to mess with that, but by default, every user that logs in and wants to start an app essentially launches a Docker container that creates a lot of separation between users. But the other interesting thing here, that I think a lot of these types of frameworks have, like Shiny Proxy and obviously Posit Connect, is that tinyshinyserver boasts a web-based dashboard on port 3839 that shows you sort of admin level statistics on real-time connection counts, IP addresses of users, app health status. Supposedly, again, I haven't played around with this. I don't know if you peaked at port 3839 while you were trying it out yourself, Eric.
Yeah, I did. It was, some pretty interesting metrics. I'm, again, all impressed just from the R side of things. It's crazy to me.
Very interesting. And then the last sort of feature around management and monitoring is automatic memory management. It boasts, such as cleaning up stale connections after 30 minutes, assuming that's the default, and then clearing dead process objects that obviously may remain after users end their session. But very, very interesting. Particularly I think for those that find or don't need crazy full scale production deployments for what they're trying to host. This might be sort of a quick start version, simple sort of JSON configuration here that may get you up and running in a smaller production-ish setting or POC setting.
Yeah, I mean, again, impressive technically how all this was done, and I can definitely see value in exploring kind of under the hood from the friendly confines of R, how all of these different concepts work. So, yep, this got my attention, and I may play with it a bit more just to see just what are the internals of this package really doing. At my quick glance last night, it looked like some use of reference classes and whatnot. So it's definitely using some kind of object-oriented programming, which again, interesting to see what drives behind the choices of these different frameworks, and also seeing how this compares to some of the great packages that Thomas Lynn Peterson at Posit has created with his take on web technology in R, with like his Fiery package and other packages that the Plumber 2 reinvention of Plumber is basing off of as its dependency footprint. So yeah, definitely something I'm going to ponder. And like I always say, every time we do this show, I learn something new, and this was by far a new take on Shiny session management, again, straight from R itself. So who knows what you find out on these issues, and you can find out a lot more. Guess what? You just go to rwiki.org. This is the first issue of 2026. So we hope to have obviously many more after this. And we have our curator team ready to help out with the rest of the issues. Before we go, I do want to acknowledge some interesting feedback, not so much feedback from our contact page, but we were recently, recently got a nice note from a listener, I believe, Jan Turman over on Blue Sky, who did an interesting analysis of scraping the transcripts of our very podcast and doing the episode length across time of what we've talked about. And I put a link in our show notes, Mike, if you want to check it out. But there's an interesting spike apparently in 2022 somewhere where we had a long episode, and it's been a general trend back up. So you and I doing long episodes, who would have thought that, right? But it's an interesting graph, and apparently he's been listening to us while biking across America. So hey, if we can make your bike rides more fun, we're here for you, buddy.
That is awesome. Thank you for that analysis. I can't wait to check it out. And we may ramble once in a while, but only once in a while.
It's sporadic. I mean, the data shows it. So
perfect.
Who knows? Yeah. Well, anyway, you tune in for our content. Maybe you stay for the rants opinion. Maybe I have that flipped around. I have no idea. Nonetheless, if you want to find out more, obviously everything's at rwiki.org. This is a community project. Obviously, we value your input, and how you can help out is sending those great resources via a pull request to our GitHub repository of R Weekly. Everything's available at rwiki.org. It's not hard to find. And also, we love hearing from you, whether you shout us out on social media or you get into our contact page on the episode show notes. We're all right there. This podcast has great transcripts, as we just heard, as well as chapter markers, so you can always skip to whatever highlight you're interested in. Hopefully you listen to the whole episode, but we won't judge. Nonetheless, we're just happy you're listening at all. So with that, you can get in touch with me on social media in various ways. I am on Blue Sky with @rpodcast at bsky.social. I'm also on Mastodon, where I'm @rpodcast at podcastindex.social. And I'm on LinkedIn. Just search my name and you will find me causing trouble there. Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky at mike-thomas.bsky.social, or you can find me on LinkedIn by searching Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK, and see what I'm up to lately.
Very nice stuff, and it's great to get back in 2026 with you. And yeah, I'll try to keep my ranting to a minimum sometimes, but I can't guarantee it. But nonetheless, I think we got relatively unscathed here. Any feedback's welcome, no matter how far I take it. All right. Well, that will do it for episode 217 of Our Weekly Highlights, and we will be back with another edition of Our Weekly Highlights next week.